In the late 1930s, Chicago's South Side vibrated with the sound of the blues. Muddy Waters, Big Bill Broonzy, Tampa Red. These names echo through history. But there's another name, a name that appears in a handful of documents, then vanishes completely. Lou Weaver, a blues guitarist who supposedly played the same venues, recorded for the same labels, knew the same musicians. Yet today, almost nothing remains. No recordings you can find, no photographs. Newspaper archives that should mention him don't. It's as if someone took an eraser to history itself. This is the story of that erasure and the troubling questions it raises. The few traces of Lou Weaver that survive are maddeningly vague. A copyright registration from 1937 for a song called Memphis Bound lists L. Weaver as composer. A Chicago Defender classified section from August 1938 advertises Lou Weaver and his South Side Six at the Plantation Club on 35th Street. One musician's union roster from 1939 includes the name. These aren't fabrications. They exist in physical archives at the Library of Congress, the Chicago History Museum, and the AFM Local 208 records. But beyond these breadcrumbs, silence. For a musician supposedly active during blues' golden age, this absence is extraordinary and deeply suspicious. To understand why Weaver's disappearance matters, we need context. The late 1930s represented a crucial moment in American music history. The blues was transitioning from rural acoustic traditions to urban electric styles. Chicago had become the epicenter, drawing musicians from Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee during the Great Migration. Recording technology was improving. Radio was booming. This was an era of documentation, of archive building. Major labels like Bluebird, Vocalion, and Decca were frantically recording black musicians. The Library of Congress sent field researchers south. Everything was being captured, supposedly. Yet Lou Weaver, reportedly active in this documented world, left almost no trace. The first serious researcher to notice the Weaver anomaly was Dr. Helena Morrison, an ethnomusicologist at Northwestern University. In 2003, while cross-referencing Chicago venue listings with musician union records, she found Weaver's name recurring between 1936 and 1940. Always in the context of live performances, never recordings. It was statistically improbable, Morrison explained in a 2015 interview. Musicians this active almost always recorded something, even if just a radio transcription or a field recording. The absence suggested either incredible bad luck or intentional suppression. Morrison's research, published in the Journal of Blues Studies, opened a door that couldn't be closed. Other researchers began looking, and they found nothing. Just more absence. But absence, as any historian knows, can be its own kind of evidence. Dr. Morrison identified at least 17 Chicago venues where Weaver allegedly performed between 1936 and 1940. The Plantation Club, Ruby's Lounge, the Tick-Tock Tavern. Each venue kept performance logs which survived in various archives. Yet in those logs, gaps. Entire weeks missing from the Plantation Club records in 1938, precisely when newspaper ads listed Weaver's band. Ruby's Lounge burned down in 1941, destroying its records entirely. The Tick-Tock's logbooks skip from June to September 1939. Selective destruction, Morrison wondered, or just bad archival luck? The pattern was troubling. Every documented Weaver appearance corresponded with a missing or destroyed record. Then there are the radio broadcasts. In the late 1930s, Chicago radio stations WGN, WJJD, and WIND regularly featured live blues performances. These shows were sometimes transcribed, recorded onto large acetate discs for potential rebroadcast or archival purposes. The FCC required stations to keep program logs. Those logs, now housed at the National Archives, show several broadcasts that should have featured Weaver. A WGN Midnight Blues show from November 1938, a WJJD South Side Serenade from March 1939. But when researchers requested the corresponding transcription discs from various archives, they'd been destroyed, lost, or never existed in the first place. One archivist at the University of Chicago told Morrison, "We have transcriptions from every month of 1938, except November. It's the only gap in 5 years." The conspiracy theory gained traction in online forums around 2008. Enthusiasts began calling it the Weaver wipe. The basic premise: someone with access and authority systematically removed Lou Weaver from the historical record. But why? Who? And how could such an erasure be so thorough? The leading theory centered on the American Federation of Musicians, specifically AFM Local 208, the Black Musicians Union in Chicago. In the 1930s, the AFM was engaged in brutal jurisdictional battles, particularly over broadcasting rights and recording royalties. Musicians who violated union rules, who recorded off the books or crossed picket lines, could be blacklisted. Blacklisted musicians weren't just denied work. Sometimes their past work was suppressed. Discographies were altered. Credits were removed. The union had power and motivation. This is where testimony becomes crucial. In 2011, researcher James Tolliver tracked down 3 surviving musicians who'd played Chicago's South Side in the late 1930s. All 3 were in their 90s. 2 remembered Weaver clearly. Guitarist Samuel "Skip" Hayes, then 94, recalled, "Lou Weaver could play slide like nobody else. He had this technique, different from Tampa Red, different from all of them. I sat in with his band twice at Ruby's." Hayes described Weaver as tall, light-skinned, always wore a gray suit. Details that don't match the sparse surviving documentation, which describes Weaver as short and stocky in the single union record that includes physical description. When Tolliver pointed out this discrepancy, Hayes became agitated. "I know what I remember," he insisted. "Someone's been changing the records." The second witness, pianist Dorothy Mae Johnson, told a different story. At 91, she maintained sharp recall of the era. "Lou Weaver?" she said when Tolliver asked. "He was trouble, always trouble with the union." Johnson claimed Weaver had been involved in a 1939 dispute over a recording session. He went into a studio with some white musicians, not union approved. When Local 208 found out, they came down hard, real hard. I heard they not only blacklisted him, they made sure nobody would ever find those recordings. Johnson couldn't remember which studio, which session, or which white musicians, but her certainty was striking. She also described Weaver as medium height, dark-skinned, wore wire-rimmed glasses. Another contradiction. Was this faulty memory or evidence that different people named Lou Weaver existed? The third witness, bassist Leonard Cross, claimed he'd never heard of Lou Weaver at all. "And I knew everyone," Cross stated flatly. "If he played the South Side regularly, I'd know him. Either this is mistaken identity or someone's pulling your leg." Cross's denial might seem definitive, except for one detail. When Tolliver showed him a photocopy of the 1939 Union roster that included Weaver's name, Cross studied it for a long moment, then said, "That's not right. This has been altered. Look at the typeface on that entry." Cross, who'd worked as a printing press operator after his music career, insisted the Weaver entry used a different typewriter than surrounding entries. "Someone added that name later," he claimed. Tolliver had the roster examined by a forensic document analyst who found no evidence of alteration, but also couldn't definitively prove the document's authenticity. The Union angle deepens when examining AFM Local 208's history. In 1938, the local was embroiled in a vicious internal power struggle. President Harry Gray faced challenges from reformers who accused him of corruption, specifically of taking payoffs from club owners to ignore union rules. Several musicians who'd supported the reform movement found themselves suddenly blacklisted, their careers destroyed. Researcher Patricia Owens, author of Black Musicians and Chicago Unions, 1920 to 1950, notes that Local 208 kept meticulous records, except for a mysterious gap between August 1938 and January 1939. The meeting minutes from that period vanished, Owens explained. Official correspondence? Gone. It's the most documented period in terms of external references to union conflicts, yet the union's own records are missing. Someone cleaned house. Could Lou Weaver have been caught in this purge? If he'd sided with reformers or violated union rules during the power struggle, erasure would have been brutal but systematic. The union controlled access to venues, recording studios, and radio broadcasts. They could ensure a musician never worked again. But could they erase historical evidence? Only if they had cooperation. From venue owners who depended on union musicians, from radio stations that needed union clearance, from record labels that couldn't release music without union approval. In the tightly controlled world of 1930s Chicago music, such cooperation wasn't unlikely. It was standard practice. The union had power that would be unthinkable today, and they weren't afraid to use it. Then there's the racial dimension, which cannot be ignored. The music industry in the 1930s was viciously segregated and exploitative. Black musicians were routinely cheated out of royalties, credits, and even their own compositions. Race records, as blues recordings were called, made fortunes for white executives, while black artists received pittance. If Weaver had attempted to work outside this system, if he'd tried to negotiate fair contracts or retain copyright control, he would have made powerful enemies, not just within the union, but within the record labels themselves. Researcher Angela Torres notes, "We have documented cases of labels literally destroying master recordings to avoid paying royalties to black artists." Physical erasure wasn't metaphorical. It was business strategy. The copyright registration for Memphis Bound adds another wrinkle. Filed in 1937, it lists L. Weaver as sole composer and copyright holder. Unusual for the era, when labels typically controlled copyrights. This suggests Weaver may have been savvy about intellectual property rights. But there's a problem. No recording of Memphis Bound exists in any archive. No sheet music, no lyrics, just the copyright registration itself. Attempts to locate Weaver's heirs, who would legally hold the copyright today, have failed. No death certificate has been found. No obituary. No grave. Lou Weaver simply stops appearing in records after 1940. He didn't leave Chicago as far as anyone can determine. He didn't die, at least not officially. He just evaporated. Radio broadcasts remain the most tantalizing missing piece. The FCC program logs confirm that Chicago stations aired blues shows during the exact period Weaver was supposedly active. Those logs sometimes included performer names, though often just listed Blues Quartet or Southside Band. But transcription discs, the actual recordings, are nearly impossible to find. The University of Chicago holds about 3,000 radio transcriptions from the 1930s Chicago. Researcher David Kim spent 6 months listening to every blues-related disc. I found performances by Brunsey, Tampa Red, Memphis Minnie, Jazz Gillum, dozens of musicians, Kim reported. But several discs had been deliberately damaged. Deep scratches, gouges, sometimes entire sections removed. Someone didn't want these specific recordings heard. Whether those damaged discs contained Weaver performances, we'll never know. The damage is irreversible. In 2017, a breakthrough, or a dead end, depending on perspective. An elderly woman in Detroit, Clara Weaver Johnson, contacted historian Morrison, claiming to be Lou Weaver's niece. She possessed a photograph, a young black man holding a guitar, standing outside a Chicago club, date stamped 1937 on the reverse. The man wore a gray suit. The photograph showed him as tall and light-skinned, matching Skip Hayes' description. "This is Uncle Lou," Johnson insisted. "My grandmother kept this hidden for decades. She said he'd gotten in trouble, and the family wasn't supposed to talk about him." Morrison had the photograph authenticated. It was legitimate, from the 1930s, taken in Chicago. But proving the man was Lou Weaver proved impossible. No other photographs existed for comparison. No living relatives could confirm. Johnson died in 2019, taking her certainty with her. The skeptical view is worth examining. Perhaps Lou Weaver was simply an obscure musician who never achieved success, whose minimal documentation accurately reflects his minimal impact. The late 1930s Chicago blues scene was crowded. Hundreds of musicians competed for limited opportunities. Most left little trace. The surviving references to Weaver might represent the entirety of his career. A few gigs, one copyright filing, then obscurity. The contradictory testimonies from elderly musicians could be faulty memory, conflation of different people, or genuine confusion across 8 decades. The missing records and damaged transcriptions could be coincidence, not conspiracy. Occam's razor suggests the simplest explanation. Lou Weaver was nobody special, and history correctly forgot him. But Occam's razor cuts both ways. Is it simpler to believe that every archive relating to Weaver coincidentally vanished? That multiple witnesses remember him vividly yet inconsistently? That his copyright exists but his music doesn't, all by chance? Or is it simpler to accept that someone with means and motive systematically removed evidence? The pattern of gaps, venue logs, radio transcriptions, union records, clusters around 1938 to 1939, the exact period of Local 208's internal crisis. That's not random distribution, that's targeted deletion. And while individual pieces of evidence can be dismissed, the cumulative weight becomes harder to ignore. Something happened to Lou Weaver. The question isn't whether he existed, it's why someone worked so hard to make us think he didn't. Modern researchers have employed digital tools to search for Weaver traces. Database algorithms scan digitized newspapers for his name. Audio recognition software analyzes surviving 1930s blues recordings for stylistic fingerprints matching descriptions of his technique. So far, nothing definitive. But in 2022, a University of Illinois team using machine learning to reconstruct damaged audio files made an intriguing discovery. A severely degraded radio transcription from 1938 previously considered too damaged to process, yielded fragments of intelligible audio. A male voice introducing "Memphis Bound" by our special guest tonight. The audio quality is too poor to determine the guest's name, but "Memphis Bound," Weaver's copyrighted composition. The performance itself remains unintelligible, just enough to tantalize, too little to prove anything. The union's role remains central to most theories. AFM Local 208 operated with near impunity in the 1930s. Musicians who challenged union authority found themselves unemployable. But would the union go beyond blacklisting? Would they systematically erase someone from history? Dr. Patricia Owens argues yes, pointing to other documented cases of union retaliation. They didn't just destroy careers, Owens notes. They destroyed reputations. They'd spread rumors, forged documents claiming musicians had violated contracts, even pay venue owners to claim certain musicians had never worked there. Creating a fake history was easier than maintaining a real one. In Weaver's case, Owens theorizes, the erasure might have been insurance. If you remove someone so thoroughly that they never existed, they can't come back and sue for damages. There's also a darker possibility, one that researchers are reluctant to voice but can't entirely dismiss. What if Lou Weaver crossed lines far more serious than union rules? Chicago in the late 1930s was controlled by organized crime. Clubs were often mob-owned. Musicians sometimes witnessed things they shouldn't. If Weaver had seen something or refused to cooperate with criminal interests, his erasure might not have been bureaucratic, but existential. The mob had resources to destroy records, intimidate witnesses, and ensure permanent silence. No researcher wants to suggest murder without evidence, but the totality of Weaver's disappearance, including the absence of a death record or obituary, raises grim questions. Sometimes people don't just vanish from history. Sometimes they vanish entirely. The alternate Lou Weaver theory offers a stranger explanation. What if Lou Weaver was a pseudonym used by multiple musicians? In the 1930s, some performers used stage names to circumvent exclusivity contracts or appear at competing venues. If several guitarists performed as Lou Weaver at different times, this would explain the contradictory physical descriptions, the scattered documentation, and the impossibility of tracking him. When one Weaver stopped using the name, another might have adopted it. The copyright filing could be from one musician, the union roster from another, the venue advertisements from a third. This theory would mean there's no single Lou Weaver to find, just a ghost name that drifted through Chicago's blues scene, attached to whoever needed an identity that evening. Whatever the truth, the Lou Weaver case highlights a troubling reality about historical documentation. We assume that important things get recorded, that significant people leave traces, that history captures what matters. But the historical record is not neutral. It's created by people with power, preserved by institutions with biases, and accessed through gatekeepers who decide what's important. Black musicians in the 1930s existed in a system designed to exploit and marginalize them. If the system decided someone needed to be erased, it had the tools to do so. The absence of Lou Weaver from history doesn't prove he was erased, but the thoroughness of that absence suggests that if someone wanted to erase him, they succeeded completely. Today, researchers continue searching. New archives get digitized. Elderly witnesses sometimes emerge with forgotten memories. Technology improves, allowing damaged recordings to be restored. Perhaps someday, we'll find Lou Weaver's music, or a photograph that definitively identifies him, or documents that explain what happened in those missing months of 1938 and 1939. Until then, he remains what he's always been, a gap in the record, a name without a face, a copyright without a song, evidence that someone existed and someone else wanted them forgotten. Whether that forgetting was conspiracy or coincidence, malicious or mundane, we may never know. But the question itself tells us something important about who gets remembered and who gets erased from the story we tell ourselves about the past.